Thank you very much, Lou, and thank you, President Ryan, for including me on this very special evening to help me inaugurate your tenure as the new president of this august institution. And of course, it is an august institution. The opening of the Boston Public Library in, I believe it was 1854, followed by just a century and a quarter, the founding of Benjamin Franklin's Library Company of Philadelphia, the first lending library in America. In this age of the internet, I think some people mistakenly believe that the need for public libraries like this one is starting to wane. Nothing could be further from the truth. With each ensuing technology, the role of our public libraries has evolved and enlarged, and never eclipsed. And I'm confident that President Ryan will be equal to the challenge of preserving that tradition, a tradition grounded in the fundamental reality that the mission of the library, dedicated to universal access to the great body of human learning, has never been encompassed by the physical contents of any set of buildings. For the truth surely is that no building could ever contain the substance of the knowledge it embodies. To invert the wonderful title of Anthony Powell's 1971 novel, Books Do Furnish a Room, what books truly furnish is not a room or a building, but a mind. The observation once made of that cultural icon, Elvis Presley, that he had left the building, could always be made of the books and pamphlets housed in the stacks and on the shelves of a structure like this one. Now, that is a fitting introduction to the subject I want to share with you all this evening before we open the floor to some conversation and some questions and I hope some answers. The subject addressed in more detail in my latest book, The Invisible Constitution. I think I can set the stage most helpfully by recalling a visit that I was privileged to make to the 5th grade class at Mason Rice Elementary School in Newton, a class of a special friend of mine named Jeremy Lewin. Jeremy is here in the front row with us this evening. He's an enormously bright, I know I'm going to embarrass him, but he's an enormously bright, lively 11-year-old son of a couple, Dora and Michael Lewin, with whom I've enjoyed a very close friendship for more than a quarter of a century. Jeremy's class had been studying the Constitution of the United States and had been writing a Constitution of its own. And I think in the course of that, Jeremy told his classmates that he knew this guy who helped write constitutions in Russia, the Czech Republic, Marshall Islands, South Africa. He also did some arguing in the Supreme Court. He taught constitutional law, and I think they say, yeah. And so Jeremy decided that for show and tell, he would try to bring me. And when I was invited, I leapt at the opportunity. I love kids, and I showed up. It was a wonderful experience. I really was sad to see it end. I have to tell you that 5th grade class, and this is not in any way denigrate my own really extraordinarily bright and wonderful students, was more fun to teach than any Harvard Law School class that I had ever taught. See, because they were, in fact, writing their own Constitution. And the conversation turned to how that Constitution related to the rules of the school, how they in turn related to the bylaws of the city and to the Constitution of Massachusetts, and how that related to the Constitution of the country. And it turned out that they weren't finished with their own Constitution, but they had enacted a bunch of rules about homework and things of that sort. And so, to the consternation of Jeremy's teacher, I said, well, how can these rules that you've enacted have any power? How can they be enforced if you don't even have a Constitution that tells you which rules are valid and which ones aren't? Maybe you should just disregard those rules. And the teacher looked aghast. So we explored the question of how you can tell what's a valid rule and what isn't, what's in the Constitution, what isn't. One of the things I asked the kids in the class was, do you know how many times the U.S. Constitution has been amended? You know, it's been around for a couple hundred years. You'd imagine it had been amended lots of times. And the class was already very well prepared. And one student said 26 times, and somebody else said 27 times. And that was kind of an interesting beginning of the discussion, because you see some copies of the U.S. Constitution have just 26 amendments, and others include the 27th. Technical little amendment about congressional pay raises, an amendment that was proposed along with the Bill of Rights back in 1789, but it somehow didn't catch fire the way the First Amendment did, or the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. It was a little boring. And unlike the Bill of Rights, which was ratified in 1791, this straggler didn't make it until 1992, when the Michigan legislature finally sort of ratified that amendment. And so I asked the kids, you know, do you imagine, why do you think some copies of the Constitution don't have this amendment? And they were very imaginative. Some of them said, well, maybe because they were printed before 1992. And we looked, and some of them actually were printed more recently, and they still didn't have it. So one kid thought, well, maybe they were lazy and they just copied the old Constitution. We finally got to the point that, in fact, there's some dispute over whether this late comer to the Constitution is really a valid part of the document at all. In fact, as I think I mentioned, I had an argument with Justice Scalia, with whom I'm having dinner at Harvard Law School tomorrow night, as a matter of fact. We had an argument at Princeton when he was giving a lecture and I was a commentator over whether the 27th Amendment was a valid part of the Constitution. And I said I thought it was. I had a Wall Street Journal article explaining why I thought it was, and he wasn't so sure. He thought, no, because when a constitutional amendment is proposed to the states, it's like an offer. And if the offer is not accepted by enough states within a reasonable period of time, then like any contractual offer, it might lapse. I thought, you know, for a guy who's really into rules and having everything black and white and very crystal clear, something as mushy as a reasonable time to ratify an amendment didn't make a lot of sense, and we had an interesting argument. But who could resolve it? Well, I suppose if the issue came before him, he could resolve it. He, after all, has a vote, and I don't. But what would you look to resolve it? I talked to the kids in the class, how would you decide whether this is part of the Constitution or not? Could you read in the Constitution? Would it tell you what's really in it and what isn't in it? And I think kids quite quickly got the idea that the Constitution couldn't possibly answer all of the questions you might want to ask about what's in it, what isn't in it, how do you read it? Do you read it in the way that Justice Scalia likes to read it, by focusing on the supposed original intent of the framers? Do you read it in a more evolving way? Is there an instruction? Turn it upside down, look inside? Well, there are some instructions, but how do you read those instructions? I think the kids were fascinated by the fact that this document can't really answer all the questions you might want to ask of it. And then we, of course, talked about stuff like the right to bear arms and religious freedom and so on. But it turns out that the kids were really interested in this abstract question of what does the Constitution mean that it doesn't actually say? And after the class was over, the teacher asked the kids to write me letters, and they actually wrote handwritten letters. They weren't even on word processors. They were real letters, and it was a great pleasure to read them. I've still got them. And they were asked to say what was it that most interested them in the class. And I expected that they would talk about the death penalty or search and seizure or freedom of speech. But way over 2/3 of the class said they were interested in this 27th Amendment and in the invisible Constitution. That is, the things that are part of the Constitution and that tell you something about its meaning, but that aren't really written down within it. And that convinced me. I just finished this book, but I hadn't written the preface yet. That convinced me that I ought to recount this 5th grade tale in the preface, and when you get the book, you'll see that it's in there. And I concluded that if a bunch of very bright, admittedly unusually bright 5th graders could get fascinated by something as abstract as this, then I wasn't really barking up the wrong tree by writing a book about the invisible Constitution. I was addressing intelligent lay people and not just technicians